From New York, this is Democracy Now!
In areas with substantial and high transmission, CDC recommends fully vaccinated people wear masks in public indoor settings to help prevent the spread of the Delta variant and protect others.
The CDC has issued new recommendations that even vaccinated people return to wearing masks. As President Biden announces today, all civilian federal workers will be required to be vaccinated. We'll speak with emergency room doctor, former Baltimore City Health Commissioner Leana Wen about what's next and her new book, Lifelines, A Doctor's Journey in the Fight for Public Health. Then the Senate has voted to open debate on a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that includes new spending on climate and environment measures.
As Majority Leader, I have made it clear I will not pass an infrastructure package that does not reduce carbon pollution at a scale commensurate with the urgency of the climate crisis we face. Plain and simple, and that's what Democrats intend to do.
But critics say the infrastructure bill falls far short of what's needed. We'll speak with climate researcher Leah Stokes.
These unprecedented extreme weather events happening all across the country are reminding us that Congress needs to act on the climate crisis now and pass a bold plan through budget reconciliation this summer.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate's voted to open debate on a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that contains $550 billion in new spending. The bill is expected to include $110 billion for roads and bridges, $66 billion for passenger and freight rail projects, $65 billion for broadband internet, $55 billion for clean drinking water, and $39 billion for public transit. Many Republicans voted to advance the bill after Democrats agreed to remove a proposal to strengthen the ability of the Internal Revenue Service to catch tax cheats. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer praised the deal.
Mr. President, I want to commend the group of senators who worked with President Biden to reach an agreement on a bipartisan infrastructure bill. The Senate has just come together and, in a strong bipartisan fashion, voted to begin the legislative process here on the Senate floor.
Democrats are also hoping to pass a separate $3.5 trillion bill through the reconciliation process, but that effort may be doomed after Democratic Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona came out against it on Wednesday. Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez criticized Sinema on Twitter, writing, quote, "Good luck tanking your own party's investment in child care, climate action, and infrastructure," AOC said. The World Trade Organization has failed again to agree on a proposal to temporarily waive intellectual property rights for coronavirus vaccines. Key opponents to the proposal include the European Union, Japan, and South Korea. This comes as a new study by the People's Vaccine Alliance finds the cost of vaccinating the world would be 5 times cheaper if vaccine manufacturers weren't making billions in profit. The alliance estimated Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna are charging governments as much as $41 billion above the estimated cost of production. Meanwhile, President Biden is announcing today all civilian federal workers will be required to get vaccinated or face regular testing. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has ordered all patient-facing healthcare workers at state-run hospitals to get vaccinated. All other New York State employees must get vaccinated or face regular testing. Google and Facebook have also announced new vaccine mandates for workers. We'll have more on the pandemic after headlines with Dr. Leana Wen. A major new study by the Urban Institute has found poverty in the United States has temporarily fallen by 45% thanks to government aid programs instituted during the pandemic. Child poverty has dropped by a record 61%, but the gains may be short-lived as the federal government halts stimulus checks, increased food stamps, expanded employment, and other programs. A federal moratorium on evictions ends on Saturday. Housing activists fear millions of people who owe back rent may soon be at risk of losing their homes. Meanwhile, a lobbyist group for landlords has sued the U.S. government to recover lost rent due to the eviction moratorium. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has broken from other top Democrats by claiming only Congress, not President Biden, has the power to cancel student debt. She's also raised objections to proposals for broad-based debt cancellation.
Suppose your family was not, your child just decided they want to, at this time, not want to go to college, but you're paying taxes to forgive somebody else's obligations. You may not be happy about that.
Meanwhile, a growing number of historically black colleges and universities have been using federal pandemic relief funds to help erase student debt. Last week, South Carolina State University helped more than 2,500 students by erasing nearly $10 million in student debt. In Peru, the socialist teacher and union leader, Pedro Castillo, was sworn in as president Wednesday as the country marked 200 years of independence. In a speech to the nation, Castillo vowed to be a champion of the poor.
Una persona que pertenece, como muchos de los peruanos,
a person who belongs to, as many Peruvians do, to sectors that have been oppressed for centuries. It is the first time a political party formed in the country's interior wins the elections democratically, and that a teacher, specifically a rural teacher, is elected constitutional president of the republic. It is difficult to express the high honor this means to me right now.
Pedro Castillo also pledged to heal the wounds of colonialism and announced he would not live in the government palace in Lima. In news from the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces have shot dead a 12-year-old Palestinian boy named Mohammed al-Alami while he sat in the back seat of his father's car at an Israeli checkpoint north of Hebron. Mohammed is the 11th Palestinian child shot and killed by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank this year. That's according to the Defense for Children International, which publicized Mohammed's killing on Wednesday. Earlier today, Israeli forces raided the group's main office, seizing files about Palestinian children in Israeli detention. Meanwhile, an Israeli soldier shot dead a Palestinian plumber on his way home from work in the West Bank town of Beita on Tuesday. Shadi Omar Lotfi Salim is at least the 7th Palestinian killed recently near Beita, which has been the scene of numerous protests against a proposed Israeli settlement. Israel has launched what has been described as a maximum pressure campaign against Ben & Jerry's and its parent company Unilever after the iconic ice cream brand announced it would halt sales in Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. Israel's asked 35 U.S. governors to enforce state laws which make it a crime to support the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, or BDS. Last week, the head of the New York State Common Retirement Fund wrote to Unilever saying it was examining whether Ben & Jerry's had violated state policy on Israeli boycotts. Meanwhile, Brad Lander, the Democratic nominee for New York City Comptroller, criticized the state's position, saying, quote, actions that erase the distinction between Israel and its settlements and occupied territory are effectively endorsing annexation and today's unjust one-state status quo, he said. A number of Jewish groups, including J Street, the New Israel Fund, and Americans for Peace Now, all of whom oppose BDS, have defended Ben & Jerry's decision and rejected accusations that Ben & Jerry's decision is anti-Semitic. Meanwhile, the founders of Ben & Jerry's, who no longer have operational control of the company, have defended the company's decision. Writing in the New York Times, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield describe themselves as proud Jews and supporters of the State of Israel. They write, quote, we believe this act can and should be seen as advancing the concepts of justice and human rights, core tenets of Judaism, they write. French President Emmanuel Macron has acknowledged France owes a debt to French Polynesia, where the French carried out nearly 200 nuclear tests between 1966 and 1996, but Macron stopped short of apologizing during a visit to the South Pacific territory. A recent investigation by the French investigative website Disclose estimated 100,000 French Polynesian residents may have been exposed to radiation from the tests. High-ranking diplomats from the United States and Russia, the world's two largest nuclear superpowers, met in Geneva, Switzerland Wednesday to discuss arms control and other issues. This comes a month after President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed to begin a bilateral dialogue on nuclear arms. The two countries possess about 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. Two whistleblowers have warned Congress about the dire conditions at the Fort Bliss military base in El Paso, Texas, where the government has set up large tents to hold thousands of unaccompanied migrant children. The whistleblowers say children are held in filthy conditions without adequate mental and health care. In a statement, one of the whistleblowers, Arthur Perlstein, said, quote, "Gross mismanagement, waste, and abuse of authority by those at the top who insisted on utmost secrecy led to conditions for thousands of children at Fort Bliss that can only be described as constituting mistreatment," he said. Perlstein is a director at the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. In other news from Texas, 2 people died and 30 were hospitalized after a chemical leak at a plant outside Houston Tuesday. The company, LyondellBasell, says 100,000 pounds of acetic acid accidentally leaked from its plant in La Porte. The leak occurred less than a week after authorities in La Porte had to issue a shelter-in-place order following a chemical leak at a nearby Dow Chemical plant. Voting rights activists have begun a Selma to Montgomery-style march in Texas to protest Republican efforts to pass sweeping voter suppression legislation. Marchers are calling for an end to the filibuster, passage of the For the People Act, and the full restoration of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign is helping to lead the 27-mile march.
What we see happening here is happening all over the country. Yeah. And Texas is like the canary in the mine. Right. And that's why we're in Texas, just like Alabama was the canary in the mine in '65. Right. Texas is the canary in the mine in 2021. Yes, sir. And we must nationalize Texas. That's right. In order to change the whole country.
A former Virginia police officer who participated in the January 6th insurrection is back in jail after investigators learned the man, Thomas Robertson, had placed an order for 37 guns after his arrest. Investigators had also found M4 military-style rifle and a partially assembled pipe bomb at his home. In addition, prosecutors accused Robertson of calling for more violence after January 6th. The Washington Post reports the former doctor of the USA gymnastics team, Larry Nassar, has spent more than $10,000 on himself in prison while paying just $100 a year to his victims. In 2018, Nassar was sentenced to up to 175 years in prison for sexually assaulting and abusing more than 160 young female athletes, including Olympic gold medal winner Simone Biles. Attorney John Manley, who represents many of the gymnasts abused by Nassar, criticized the Bureau of Prisons, saying, quote, "They're allowing the worst child predator in American history to spend thousands of dollars on himself and pay $8 a month to his victims. Something is completely broken and needs to be fixed," he said. And longtime journalist Glenn Ford has died at the age of 71. He was co-founder of Black Agenda Report and a vocal critic of President Obama.
We at Black Agenda Report have for some time been saying that Obama is not the lesser of evils, but the more effective evil. He's first of all created a model for austerity, a veritable model with his Deficit Reduction Commission. And he's introduced preventive detention, a law for preventive detention. He's expanded the theaters of war and drone wars, and he's made an unremitting assault on international law.
The late Glenn Ford speaking on Democracy Now! In 2012 in a debate with Michael Eric Dyson. You can watch the full debate at DemocracyNow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. Coming up, we'll speak with emergency room Dr. Lena Wen, Baltimore's former health commissioner, about the pandemic and her new book, Lifelines, A Doctor's Journey in the Fight for Public Health. Stay with us. All the Same by Vieux Farka-Touré. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Democracy Now! Co-host Nermeen Sheikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Experts are warning vaccine inequality could lead to a prolonged COVID-19 pandemic, even as the World Trade Organization has failed again to agree on a proposal to temporarily waive intellectual property rights for coronavirus vaccines. This comes as a new study by the People's Vaccine Alliance finds the cost of vaccinating the world would be 5 times cheaper if vaccine manufacturers were not making billions in profit. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, where the Olympics are underway, Japanese officials have reported record-breaking coronavirus cases that set an all-time high since the pandemic began. In Indonesia, new epicenter of the pandemic in Asia, officials have extended COVID-19 restrictions to August 2nd and stepped up vaccination drives. Here in the United States, President Biden is formally announcing today that civilian federal employees must be vaccinated or face regular testing and follow social distancing guidelines. Google and Facebook have also announced vaccine mandates for workers, and more than 600 universities have announced mandates for students and employees. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo announced Wednesday all state hospital employees must be vaccinated with no testing options for the unvaccinated.
The court has upheld, and the Department of Justice just did a memo that says an employer can mandate an employee get vaccinated. We're taking the first major step down this road. We're saying in state hospitals where the state is the employer, the frontline workers must be vaccinated, period. Not vaccinated or you have to have a test once a week. We're taking that position like other state governments. The federal government is supposed to take that position for normal public employees. But for the public employees, the hospital workers who are front-facing, we are mandating vaccinations, Bill.
On Tuesday, the CDC issued new mask guidelines that recommend even vaccinated people return to wearing masks. But state and local officials are not legally required to implement CDC guidelines. In Texas, Republican Governor Greg Abbott signed an executive order to bar local officials from requiring masks. Missouri's Republican Attorney General sued to halt a county mask mandate now in effect in St. Louis. This comes as Mississippi top health officials say they're seeing an astounding rise in COVID cases as the Delta variant spreads and threatens to overwhelm hospitals. As of last week, the CDC said 35% of U.S. counties are experiencing high levels of community transmission. For more, we're joined by Dr. Leana Wen, emergency room physician, former Baltimore health commissioner, also contributing columnist for The Washington Post, and author of her memoir, just out, Lifelines, a doctor's journey in the fight for public health. Dr. Wen, welcome back to Democracy Now! Let me start with this question. As President Biden is announcing today, civilian federal health workers, this excludes Pentagon, will be required to be vaccinated. CDC saying you got to wear masks once again, something you were opposed to when they changed a few weeks ago. In fact, the vaccines have not gotten full authorization. It's still emergency use authorization. So people who are concerned, they're saying if the federal government hasn't fully approved these, why should I risk my health? Can you talk about what's going on here and what is your answer to them?
Sure, and I just first want to clarify that I was opposed to the CDC back in May when they lifted the indoor mask requirement. I thought that the honor code was never going to work, that when vaccinated and unvaccinated people are mixing, unless there is proof of vaccination, everybody should still be wearing masks. And so I actually support what the CDC is now doing, which is going back to this indoor mask requirement, because frankly, we know that we can't trust the unvaccinated, that they have been walking around without masks. And in fact, that's what led to the surge that we're seeing. But to answer your question about what's happening now with vaccine approval, I mean, I think it's good that the FDA is making sure that we follow the right process. We don't want for anything to be rushed. But that said, whatever red tape and bureaucracy there is, we really should be cutting out, because full approval, I mean, at this point, hundreds of millions of people around the world have received these life-saving vaccines. We know, and it's been proven how safe and effective they are. So I'm not entirely sure what we're waiting for. I do know that having full approval will really pave the way for a lot more employers and schools and other institutions to implement vaccine mandates, which I strongly believe is what we need at this point. So I very much support what the Biden administration is doing with the federal government, with federal employees, saying that at this point we are in the middle of a national and international public health emergency. You have a right to stay unvaccinated if you want to, but if you want to be in public spaces, if you want to now be coming to work and be around other individuals, you don't have a right to infect others with a potentially deadly disease. So the idea of either testing or proving that you're vaccinated, I think, is exactly the right one. And FDA approval in the near future, I hope, will be coming as well.
Well, Dr. Wen, I mean, one of the things that many people have been surprised by all over the world is that despite the fact that these vaccines have been available to Americans for several months now, only 50% of Americans are fully vaccinated. It's a huge issue because, as you point out, now, especially with the spread of the Delta variant, there have also been numerous incentives offered to Americans to take the vaccine, even as, you know, around the world, people are desperate for the same vaccine. What do you think can be done, apart from, of course, the FDA granting full approval? What can be done to get people to take these vaccines? If they haven't taken them till now, is there any reason to think they'll take them in the future?
It's a really good point that you're making about American exceptionalism, which is that there are people around the world who are even healthcare workers or vulnerable older individuals who are so desperate to get the vaccine. And frankly, some people are going to die because they don't have access to the vaccine. And here we are in the U.S. sitting on this surplus really having doses that are going to go to waste. We're begging people to take the vaccine when there are people around the world begging to get access to the vaccine. And I think that we should really be thinking about who we are as a country, what are the values that we have, and what is our obligation to people around the world as well. But to your point about what is it that can be done, I think that the Biden administration has done a great job in getting vaccine supply and initially working on the vaccine rollout. They, though, have hit a wall. There's really not much else that they can do short of vaccine mandates. And that's because you just can't keep on doing more of the same at some point. You've got to admit that you've got to change tactics. I mean, you can't keep on doing education and outreach. Yes, that's really important, but that's not going to get us over this hump. We are at less than 70% of all adult Americans having received at least one dose. We are at just about a third of teens who are now eligible to get the vaccine who have gotten vaccinated. And so we really need to do something different. In the past, we know that vaccine mandates are effective. And I think we really need to be reframing how we think about them. We should be thinking about this as we do drunk driving. You have a right, if you want to be intoxicated in your home or in some other setting at a bar, let's say, but you do not have the right to be intoxicated and then get behind the wheel of a car in a way that you could potentially endanger other people. And so I think that the vaccine mandate concept is going to be increasingly important because, for example, I have 2 unvaccinated young kids. I don't know that someone has the freedom, so to speak, to transmit COVID-19 to my unvaccinated kids or to somebody with immunocompromise or cancer and is on chemotherapy.
Dr. Wen, I wanted to ask whether you think this has had any impact on people's hesitancy or outright refusal to take the vaccine, that initially there were widespread reports that so-called healthcare workers were refusing the vaccine. Now the American Medical Association has said that 96% of physicians are fully vaccinated. But healthcare workers include a very large number of people. But I think initially many may have thought that doctors themselves are refusing this vaccine. So how do we know it's safe? It seems it's not safe if doctors aren't taking it. But physicians have taken it, almost 100% of them. So what effect do you think that's had? And do you think that needs to be clarified further?
That's a really interesting point. And I think you're right that at the very beginning, we were hearing a lot of reports of healthcare workers writ large, not physicians. I mean, perhaps there were some physicians who at the beginning said, OK, I don't want to be in the first week of getting the vaccine. But you'd be very hard pressed to find any physician in the U.S. now who's not fully vaccinated and who isn't extremely enthusiastic about recommending it to our patients and to all of our family members. It is true that, especially early on, nurses, home healthcare workers, the broader swath of people, as you mentioned, who constitute healthcare workers and the healthcare profession, there were people who were hesitant. But increasingly, this group is also getting vaccinated. And we have now seen, I think of last count, more than 800 hospitals and healthcare systems are implementing some type of vaccine mandate. Because this is not new to us as healthcare workers. We are routinely required, every year we have to get the flu vaccine. We're required to have our MMR vaccines and our hepatitis vaccines because it would just be irresponsible for us to pass on diseases to our patients, some of whom are among the most vulnerable. I mean, we have an obligation to care for our patients. This is another one where I really believe that mandates are important. We've seen all these medical associations get behind the idea of vaccine mandates for healthcare workers. And I think as more healthcare workers are vaccinated, it's also important that we recognize that we are in a trusted position in our communities and begin to tell our friends and relatives and colleagues in the community writ large about the importance of vaccination.
This week, President Biden responded to questions from reporters about the millions of Americans who are still unvaccinated.
We have a pandemic because of the unvaccinated, and there's so much enormous confusion. And the more we learn about this virus and the Delta variation, the more we have to be worried and concerned. And then only one thing we know for sure. If those other 100 million people got vaccinated, we'd be in a very different world. So get vaccinated. If you haven't, you're not nearly as smart as I said you were.
So that's President Biden. The virus now quicker, sicker, younger. talk about who's packing the hospitals, who's getting intubated, people especially in their 20s, and long COVID at this point, what we understand about it. Even if you're not as sick, possibly being sicker for so much longer.
Yeah, these are really good points. And I'd say two things about where we are and who's getting sicker based on the science and based on what we're seeing. The first is that the good news is that older individuals, those who have chronic medical illnesses, tend to be the people who are vaccinated. And that's why we are seeing a shift to younger groups. But it's young people. I mean, we're talking about people in their 30s and 40s who are becoming so ill that they're dying and leaving behind their young children and families as orphans. We're talking about people in their 20s who may think that they are invincible. But exactly to your point, that they're really not. I mean, they are also getting ill. And even if they recover and leave the hospital, what ends up happening is that they have these long-haul COVID symptoms. I mean, I've seen patients, for example, who even months after they get relatively mild symptoms, they're still so short of breath that they have trouble walking just a couple of blocks. They're so tired, they have difficulty concentrating at work, and some people have even had to take disability leave because of the symptoms that they're having. Some people are also left with loss of hair, loss of smell or taste, and can't now enjoy food, and they don't know when this return to normal is going to be. And so long COVID is a real problem. I think something else that you mentioned about the younger, quicker, sicker, I think is a really good point, that with the Delta variant that we now have, we know that a person infected with the Delta variant carries 1,000 times the viral load than someone infected with the previous variants. And what that means is that that person can transmit a lot more virus. They also get ill a lot faster, and so potentially they could infect a lot more people as well. And so I think people who are unvaccinated should really know that they are at high risk, and also that this is not just, I mean, I agree with everything, the clip that you played from President Biden, but this is not just a pandemic of the unvaccinated. This is also spilling over to the vaccinated. And those who are vaccinated, we now know, based on the CDC, they are now able, but with the Delta variant, because they carry so much more virus, they could transmit it to their unvaccinated family members. And so I, for example, even though I'm fully vaccinated, my children are not because they're too young to be vaccinated. So I need to be now careful for my children because of all the unvaccinated people around us.
Many countries have been unable to secure enough vaccines for their populations, and children and students in the United States and around the world have had their education disrupted for more than a year and a half. This is James Elder of the United Nations Children's Fund speaking at a press briefing in Geneva yesterday.
More than 600 million children who aren't on an academic break remain affected by school closures, 600 million. Schools need to open as soon as possible. Reopening schools cannot wait for all teachers and students to be vaccinated. Governments at a time of great fiscal stress need to protect those education budgets. We need to find new ways to try and those children who were never in school to get them back in amid COVID.
So if you could talk about this issue of having vaccine accessibility around the world, and at the same time you have Pfizer in the United States saying people should get a third booster. They say they have evidence that it increases your ability to deal with the variant by something like 5 times. And if you're older, far more than that. And you have companies like Pfizer making record profits while, yesterday Tanzania got their first vaccines. And they're lucky. Some countries haven't gotten any.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really tricky issue. Of course, global vaccine equity is a priority. As people have said, if we don't share the vaccine with the world, the virus is going to share the world. I mean, we are going to get new variants that develop that then impact us here as well. So it's a humanitarian issue, but it's also a self-interest issue for us to share the vaccine and to figure out a better way of manufacturing the vaccine, scaling up production around the world. I think this question of the booster shot, this is why we have federal regulatory agencies. This is the way it's supposed to work, that the company produces data, they submit the data to the FDA and CDC, they then review the data and decide, are booster shots needed at this time? probably we're going to find that the booster is necessary for some people. For example, those who are severely immunocompromised, maybe older individuals with chronic medical illnesses. But that is the way that this process is supposed to work. I will go back to something you mentioned about children. You know, I just came out with my new book, Lifelines, and I talk a lot in the book about how we as a country have really failed our children here. I mean, we have consistently failed our children by not investing in early childhood education and providing childcare and so forth. But during the pandemic, we also prioritized opening bars and not schools. We also failed to invest in ventilation and other changes that could have allowed our schools to reopen safely much sooner. And I think that we are now making the same mistake. I mean, there are governors, for example, that have outlawed or banned school districts from even requiring masks come the fall. And I really worry that we are just not prioritizing our children, their learning and their health once again. And by the way, all those individuals who are not getting vaccinated right now by choice, they're also impeding the ability of our kids to safely be back in school. They're also directly exposing our children who don't have the choice to be vaccinated to COVID-19 and to potential long-term consequences. And so I hope that we as a society, as I talk about a lot on Lifelines, take a hard look at who we are and what our values are when it comes to our children.
Dr. Wen, we're just going to get into your book, but could you talk about this? You've mentioned your children now, and many people are concerned. When is the vaccine likely to be available to them? And then in your book, you speak at length about how the lack of access to public health impacts children potentially for the rest of their lives. The absence of public health, poverty, and other issues have a huge impact, not just in the moment on children, but potentially for their whole lives.
Right. With regard to FDA authorization, I would hope that for the 6 to 11-year-old group that we'll have vaccines sometime this fall, probably late fall. For the younger group, 3 to 5, maybe by winter. My hope is by this winter. And for the even younger group, 6 months to 2 years, probably at the beginning of 2022. Now, I talk in Lifelines about my own story. I talk a lot of the whole main portion of the book is talking about my experience leading Baltimore's health department and the programs that we led, for example, Be More for Healthy Babies, that as a result of home visitation programs and partnerships across our city, we were able to reduce infant mortality by 38% in a 7-year period, and also close the gap between Black and white infant mortality by over 50%. But I saw growing up as an immigrant about how people go without access to care, and how in this country we do not treat healthcare as a fundamental human right, as the human right that it really is. I mean, I was, I think, about 10 years old when a neighbor child, who was our neighbor and I knew well, he had a severe asthma attack. And his grandmother was too afraid to call for help because the family was undocumented. And she was afraid that their family would be deported and face immigration trouble if she called for help. And so she didn't. And as a result, this boy died in front of me from an asthma attack. I mean, that's something that is happening right now because we as a country just do not have a system where we value lives the same way and where we are not prioritizing our children. And so throughout my career as an ER doc and working in public health, I've seen what the needs are when it comes to understanding, for example, that housing is also a health issue, that the food that we eat, the air that we breathe are also health issues. And I think we as a society really need to look post-COVID, or the learnings from COVID, even though we're still very much in this pandemic. We need to see how can we really learn the lessons so that we are not failing our most vulnerable again.
Dr. Wen, talk specifically about your own childhood. You came to the U.S. when you were 7, and how that informed your decision to go into public health, and in particular to focus on emergency medicine.
Right. So my parents and I immigrated from China. We were fortunate to be granted political asylum here in the U.S. My parents, though, like many immigrants, worked multiple jobs, but we still had trouble making ends meet. My father worked in a restaurant delivering newspapers. My mother was working in a hotel, cleaning, while also getting her degree so that she could become a teacher, which she did. She ended up teaching 2nd grade for many years in Los Angeles. But we went through many periods where we depended on SNAP food stamps. We depended on public housing. At certain points, we were experiencing homelessness ourselves. And that very much shaped who I am and why I wanted to specifically enter the ER. The experience that I mentioned of watching a child die in front of me, when I was a child myself, I knew that I did not want to ever be in a position where I had to turn someone away because of inability to pay, or because of their immigration status, or because of health insurance or lack thereof. And so that's why I entered the ER. But it was also in the ER that I saw how much what patients need isn't just what we can do within the walls of the hospital. I mean, I had another patient who was a child with asthma, but he didn't need new inhalers. He was living in an area where he was across the street from an incinerator. And there were row houses that were around where he lived that were full of mold. And that's what was triggering his asthma. And so that's why I turned to public health and then had my dream job as Baltimore's health commissioner to lead the city to see what we can do about these social determinants of health, these other circumstances in people's health that actually determine their well-being, and why public health can actually be a critical tool for social justice.
Dr. Wen, you also talk in your book about the fierce anti-Chinese backlash in this country. Do you find, as you push for mask mandates, something you have been saying consistently, whatever the federal government says, that when you push for vaccines, you get enormous pushback as a Chinese-American woman? Are you receiving death threats now?
You know, every time I appear on air and people see how I look, there's something about being an Asian American person, a woman, talking about vaccines and masks, issues that have been so charged ideologically that somehow sets people in a direction that's extremely harmful. I mean, and it's, you know what, it's not really just about me. I mean, there are so many AAPIs here in the U.S. and Asians around the world who have been assaulted, who have been spat upon and blamed directly for the coronavirus. There have been shop owners whose shops have been destroyed and burned to the ground because people blame them for the virus. I mean, there is a real consequence to the words that people use. When our former president, for example, and other allies used words like the Kung flu or the China virus, there was this insinuation that somehow people of Asian descent are to be blamed for this global pandemic that's killed so many people. And then understandably, some people then take out their anger, understandable anger and frustration, but they take it out on people who look like me. And this is a major problem that obviously we need everyone to help us to stop anti-AAPI hate, to start using the correct language, because language in this case really matters. And I think we also need to take a stand when we're talking about, for example, the lab leak theory, which is obviously the origin of coronavirus, something we need to investigate. But we need to be investigating this in a scientific way, not putting this into the political sphere, because when we do, when we make these issues partisan, there is a direct consequence on anti-Asian hate, assault, and violence.
We want to thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Leana Wen, emergency physician, previously served as Baltimore's health commissioner, contributing columnist for the Washington Post, author of the new book, Lifelines, A Doctor's Journey in the Fight for Public Health. This is Democracy Now! Next up, the Senate's voted to open debate on a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that includes some new spending on climate and environment measures, but critics say it falls far short of what's needed in this time of a climate catastrophe. Stay with us. Mbari by Umalali and the Garifuna Collective. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. If you want to get the Democracy Now! Newsletter every day, our daily digest, send the word Democracy Now!, one word, text it to 66866. That's Democracy Now! To 66866. The Senate's voted to open debate on a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package that includes some new spending on climate and environment measures, but critics say it falls far short of what's needed. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer tried to reassure progressives during a news conference outside the Capitol.
As Majority Leader, I have made it clear I will not pass an infrastructure package that does not reduce carbon pollution at a scale commensurate with the urgency of the climate crisis we face. Plain and simple, and that's what Democrats intend to do.
Schumer was standing in front of a sign that said Climate Action Now next to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and a number of others. Democrats say they hope to include additional climate measures in a $3.5 trillion reconciliation package that could advance without being blocked by a Republican filibuster if it's backed by all 50 Democrats. But now Democratic Senator Kyrsten Sinema, the lead Democratic negotiator for the infrastructure deal, said Wednesday she will reject the $3.5 trillion proposal. Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell called her, quote, very courageous, while Democratic Congressmember Rashida Tlaib wrote on Twitter, Sinema seems not to care that her own state is flooding, the West is burning, and infrastructure around the country is crumbling. Sinema is more interested in gaining GOP friends and blocking much-needed resources and fighting for her residents' future, Rashida Tlaib said. For more, we're joined by Leah Stokes, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a researcher on climate and energy policy. Her piece out in The Atlantic magazine is headlined, The Infrastructure Bill Won't Cut It on Climate. Welcome back to Democracy Now! Professor, when we last spoke to you in June, the Senate was still trying to reach a bipartisan agreement on a new infrastructure plan. Now it looks like they've announced a deal. But in your new piece, you write it's insufficient to address the climate crisis and say we can't address a small sliver of our carbon pollution and call it a victory. Can you start off by going through what people in this country are confronting, the fires, the droughts, the flooding, as well as its connection to around the world from Siberia and beyond?
Absolutely. You know, the last month has been brutal when it comes to extreme weather events across the United States and really across the whole planet. We saw at the end of June record heat temperatures in places like Portland and Seattle, just smashing records, you know, buckling roads, killing more than 800 people. Likely that number will go up the more we learn. And, you know, also killing 1 billion organisms in the ocean that cannot handle these kinds of high heat temperatures in a region that's never experienced it before. In addition, around 60 million Americans are currently facing drought in the West. That stretches from Montana all the way down to New Mexico and to the coast. And that drought, which is really unprecedented in something like 400 years, according to scientists, that drought is also fueling a pretty bad wildfire season that's already creating huge fires like the Dixie Fire in Northern California in July. Normally, we see these kinds of fires much later in the season. And then we've also seen devastating extreme precipitation events, which has led to flooding in places like the New York subway system, highways in Detroit, parts of Texas. And that flooding is not just happening in the United States. It seems like every time you look around, another part of the world has flooded, whether it's Japan, where there were mudslides, or China, where the entire subway system in certain parts of the country is inundated with water. India, Ghana, of course, people saw really terrifying images from Germany as well as London. You know, you can take a trip around the world and find these insane flooding events happening. and that is climate change, because it turns out that as we heat up the planet, certain parts of our planet where it's warmer, that warmer air holds more water. And so scientists have been telling us for a long time that these extreme downpours leading to rapid flooding is something that's going to happen under the climate crisis. So it's been a very tough month, I think, for people all around the planet.
So, Professor Stokes, talk about what you think needs to be done. What is it? You've argued that the U.S. at least has to move to 80%, go up to 80% clean electricity in the next decade. What are the other climate investments that need to be made here? And what would you like to see elsewhere in the world?
Well, President Biden put forward a pretty good plan at the end of March to address the climate crisis. It's called the American Jobs Plan, and it was a plan to spend something between $2 and $3 trillion on the climate crisis. And that's really what I want to see enacted into law through the budget reconciliation process that Majority Leader Schumer was talking about in your clip. That's the process where we can go forward with 50 votes in the Senate. What would be in that big climate bill that we hope to pass later this summer alongside the bipartisan bill? Well, first, we would need to clean up our electricity system. We want to get to 80% clean power by 2030. That's double the amount of clean power we have today, and it would massively cut carbon pollution, as well as nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, what we call conventional air pollution, things that make people sick. So that's a really important thing, and we can do that through two policies. First, extending these tax credits for renewables, as well as other clean technologies. And second, through a clean electricity standard, a policy that says to utilities, hey, you got to get cleaning up your system. You have to be hitting that 80% clean target by 2030. And the good news is that the White House and Schumer and people like Pelosi in the House have been very clear that these are top line items, that they will be working to get those in the package. Now, we've got to do the same thing for transportation and for buildings, for other parts of our economy that create a lot of pollution. We can clean up transportation through things like electric buses and the school buses, as well as public transit, electric vehicles, charging infrastructure. We can clean up our buildings through things like programs that help people buy an induction stove or a heat pump. And all of these policies will actually drive down emissions while also investing in everyday American people and job creation in this country. So that's really the vision that I think we need to see from Congress this summer.
And so in that thing, could you talk about what the budget reconciliation package, the $3.5 trillion that Senator Bernie Sanders, in his role as the head of the Budget Committee, has been working on, what the status of that is and what you think that might achieve?
Absolutely. So that package, which would be a very bold investment in the American economy, that package is a combination of two plans that the Biden administration put forward. The American Families Plan, which focuses on things like health care and child care, really important investments, alongside the American Jobs Plan, which I mentioned was a very big, bold climate package that President Biden put forward earlier this year. So it's a combination of investing in people and their health, investing in the planet, investing in job creation. It's a really good idea. So what exactly is in that package? We don't know yet. That's been negotiated for the past several weeks, but Majority Leader Schumer has suggested, as has Senator Sanders, that perhaps next week we will start to have votes on that bill moving forward. And that is where we would find the clean electricity standard, those tax credits for renewables that I talked about, things like a civilian climate corps that the Sunrise Movement has been pushing for, investments in clean buildings, investments in clean transit, funding for worker transition, funding for rural co-ops. So these are electric co-ops who have some challenges and need to retire their fossil fuel debt, and so on and so forth, including important investments in environmental justice and cleaning up our polluted air. So that's the big, bold package. And there's a lot of things that we have to do if we want to get on top of clean air as well as the climate crisis.
This is Senator Sanders talking about investing in a civilian climate corps.
we're going to put many, many billions of dollars in a civilian climate corps. Now, you know what that means? We're going to give them decent salaries and educational benefits, whether it's the ability to go to college or pay off their debt, in order to get involved, rolling up their sleeves, whether it's dealing in California with forest issues, whether it's weatherization in homes, whether it's working for the Park Service, whatever it may be. Young people will have the opportunity to lead our country and the world in saving this planet. I'm very excited about that.
So that's Senator Sanders. He's actually speaking there to Congressmember Ro Khanna. But I wanted to ask you, you've got the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill that it looks like Senator Sinema of Arizona is going to try to torpedo because you need all 50 Democrats, and she's now saying she won't support it. And Nancy Pelosi says she will not consider the deal, the bipartisan deal, unless they also vote on the $3.5 trillion. So let's go to the bipartisan deal that was just voted on last night to at least open debate. In response to the Senate vote on the infrastructure bill Wednesday, Greenpeace USA's climate campaign director, Janet Redmond, said in a statement, "This looks like the Exxon infrastructure bill corporate lobbyists were persuading their contacts in Congress to pass. Oil companies seem to have succeeded in undermining any meaningful climate action in this bill in order to protect their profits at the cost of our health and safety." I mean, Greenpeace shreds this so-called bipartisan bill. Can you talk about your thoughts? You essentially do the same.
Yeah, you know, look, I'm a little bit more positive about the bipartisan bill because I think there are critical investments we have to make in our infrastructure. Engineers and societies have been telling us for years that we have to invest in roads and bridges. And so that might not be the top of my wish list because I care deeply about the climate crisis, but I can also understand why that's an important thing to invest in. And there are a couple things that are climate oriented in the bipartisan bill. My point is that this is not a climate bill, though, and I'll explain why. So, for example, we have some investments in public transit, in clean water, in scaling up transmission infrastructure, which is absolutely critical to bringing clean energy sort of from the center of the country to the coasts. And actually, the transmission investment is something I think we can be pretty proud of because it's probably $28 billion, and that's quite necessary. But let's talk, for example, about what it does on transit and electrification. President Biden proposed to spend about $50 billion to create 500,000 charging stations for electric vehicles. The bipartisan bill proposes to spend $7.5 billion. So that's about 15% of his goal, okay? Then we take school buses, an absolutely critical issue for children's health. When kids are riding on these school buses that are using oil to, propel them around, they're creating a lot of bad air pollution, and kids are breathing that in. It's not good for asthma. It's not good for their respiratory health. So Biden had proposed to spend $20 billion, which would have converted about 20% of our school buses to electric. But the bipartisan infrastructure deal came in again at about 10% of his plan, so just $2.5 billion. And that's terrible because it means we're only going to electrify around 8,000 school buses, or about 3% of the fleet. And just last month, while this bipartisan bill is being negotiated, we're expecting 4 times as much spending on electrifying school buses. So that is a terrible decision. In addition, we can say on public transit, the bipartisan bill is about $39 billion. Biden proposed $85. That's about half. The same for lead pipes and water infrastructure. Biden proposed $100 billion north of, and we got about 55, so about half. So the reality is there are some good investments and important things, but they are in many cases cents on the dollar. And that is why we have to really hold the line and say that the budget reconciliation process has to be a bold climate bill. And if your listeners are interested in calling the Senate and actually saying, hey, we need climate action now, there's a great website called call4climate.com. And if you go to call4climate.com, you can get patched through your senators and you can say, hey, this is not enough. We actually need a bold climate bill this summer.
Leah Stokes, we want to thank you so much for being with us, Associate Professor of Political Science at University of California, Santa Barbara, researcher on climate and energy policy. We'll link to your piece in the Atlantic magazine, The Infrastructure Bill Won't Cut It on Climate. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is currently accepting applications for our video production fellowship and our digital fellowship here in our New York City studio. You can learn more and apply at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Terracena, Tammy Warnoff, Sharina Nadura, Sam Alkofte Murray, Studio, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Honey Massoud, and Adriano Contreras. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Stelly. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Stay safe.